Good afternoon and welcome to ACU's STAR Center Compensation Webinar Series. We are excited to have you on the line with us today as we dive into this first of this four-part series. Today we'll be talking about assessing the effectiveness of staff compensation programs. I'm Suzanne Spear, Director of Workforce Development here at ACU. I'm the newest member of the STAR Center team, joining alongside Allison Abesekra and Mariah Blake. Just a few housekeeping items today. First, we are recording. It will be emailed to you at the end of this call, along with the slides. If you would like access to a copy of the slides prior to receiving that email, they're located in the handout section of the Go-To toolbar on the right of the screen. Feel free to ask questions and remember to have fun. If you do have any questions during this webinar, use the Raise Your Hand tool in the toolbar in the control panel on the right of your screen to alert the team that you have a question. You can either use the chat or questions box in the control toolbar to send your question to the team, and then we will direct it to the presenters for an answer. If you think of a question after this broadcast or would like to follow up for more information on anything presented here, email Mariah Blake at mblake@clinicians.org and she will point you in the right direction. And finally, there will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a few minutes and give us some feedback on how we did today. We are thrilled to have Ed Ura with Mercy's Consulting today leading our webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to him. Ed, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I believe it's probably afternoon for everyone. Thank you for being here. Really pleased to be a part of this program. Pleased to be introducing this first webinar in support of a tool that we are going to be working with the Associations of Clinicians for the Underserved to develop that will give you a way to test the strength of your compensation program. And what we're hoping you'll find over the course of the next hour or so is that there are some pretty good reasons to assess the strength of your staff compensation program and how it impacts how you deliver your services to your patients. I'd like to begin with just a quote here, as I want to do, and some might find it unusual to quote the art of war when we're talking about pay and people and providing services to patients, but I like to look at this quote as being emblematic of the idea that we succeed when we plan first. We succeed when we go into battle with a strategy. And of course, as most people have heard before, strategy in war typically only lasts until the first bullet is shot. But the idea is that putting things together in place and understanding why things happen the way they do is essential. And it's really no more essential anywhere else than when we're dealing with people. We need to have programs and systems in place, no matter how small an organization we are, no matter what our tax status is, we have to be prepared. And how our staff work for us, how our staff provide our services is directly related to the compensation program we have in place for them for some very obvious reasons. So let's begin by addressing some of the challenges that we have, that we face with respect to staff. First of all, I think there's pretty much will be a general agreement that our ability to provide our services to our patients is directly tied to the quality of the staff providing them. And so we have to make sure that our programs are lined up in such a way that we are able to attract and retain the type of staff that we need to achieve our missions. For those of you who are clinicians, or for those of you who employ clinicians, many folks will speak to us about the importance of recruitment and retention, and I'll go back to my last quote for a moment to just say how well you recruit and retain is going to be based on how well you go into the process of doing so. And many folks focus on how much we pay our clinicians or what sort of benefits we provide them or how good our electronic health records are, whatever the issues happen to be that most people focus on. But it's really important to note that the quality of the staff that we have is directly tied to the satisfaction, the job satisfaction of clinicians. And I point you all, if you've never looked at this before, the RAND Corporation has a wonderful study on physician satisfaction. And in that, they go through most of the important things that will impact on the way clinicians approach their work, but they spend a very good amount of time talking about the importance of support staff, both in terms of their quality and how long they are with you. This leads to the ability to establish relationships and to establish trust with support staff so that we know what we can expect from them, they know how we act, and we just begin to function more effectively as a team. Tenure and turnover, it's really important to understand that among many of these staff folk that we're talking about, these may be our lowest paid individuals in our organization. And these are individuals who may very well be in love with our mission, but at the end of the day, on a Friday evening, they have to go home and buy groceries. And if they can't afford to buy groceries, they're going to try and find some place where they can. And we have to recognize that to the extent that we're trying to be cheap with our pay programs, what we're more than likely to do is simply increase our costs by increasing our turnover and causing problems and delays in hiring and all the rest of them. And frankly, much as I hate to admit this, because I've been in the compensation business for a number of years, many of the programs that are designed by many folks, whether internally or externally, actually often cause low-skilled people to be retained and increase turnover amongst the best of our staff. And so what we want to do is point out those areas in a typical compensation program that have those issues and how we can avoid them. So what we're going to want to address today is 5 basic areas, and all 5 of these areas are going to be covered in our assessment tool that will be launched in the near future. One of them is the quality of job documentation. We can't know how to pay people, whether it's the amount of pay that we have to offer or the way in which it's administered through performance management, without quality job documentation. We need to have a compensation philosophy and a policy, because those philosophies are what dictate how we are going to design our compensation programs. We have to have some method of determining the value of jobs to our organizations, because as we'll see, not every job is exactly like a job in a survey or a job in another health center or another organization. We have to look at the validity of competitive data. Too often, people take the easy right road out, thinking that either competitive data is enough or that they can use what they can find for free on the internet. We'll talk about why it's so important that you have quality data that you can work with from year to year in assessing how competitive you are. And finally, that once you have a set of pay ranges or structure in place that is competitive and that is internally equitable, that you have the right methods for administering pay. And this is probably the area where most organizations will fail. Many organizations have no structure at all, but frankly, even those that do have structure often don't administer pay in a very effective way. So what we'll begin by doing is addressing the components of an effective staff compensation model. And as we do that, we'll look to these major areas that I've just outlined and bring up some more detailed questions to ask. You can probably, using just the slides, and certainly the last one at the end, which is sort of a test, to look at or to get an idea of how your staff compensation program lines up with some of these best practices. So if we look at our first fundamental objective, in order to determine if we have an effective staff compensation program, we need to have all the elements in place that will allow us to deliver to our staff compensation that is fair and equitable, and that is actually at the, it matches the value of the individual services to the organization. If we fail to do that, we set up a situation in which either as an organization we are using our resources the wrong way, or we are making people feel as if they are not valued, at least from a pay perspective, and providing them the opportunity to look elsewhere. Now, we all know that pay is certainly not the only element with respect to recruitment and retention, but it is certainly the easiest one to address. It is certainly the easiest one for people to say they have made these determinations. And in fact, recent studies by the Society of Human Resource Management show that pay is both the leading cause of individuals departing an organization and also the leading cause of them staying. The good pay program does its job, the bad pay program does not. So what are these elements? Well, there are basically 3, and we'll go through these in order. The first one is the value of the job to the organization. We'll talk about why that's important. We need to have a method in place by which we as organizations, we as employers, can look at each job and determine exactly what value that job has toward achieving our mission. Of course, that's a very internal focus. And in order to make sure that we are also competitive, we need to know the value of comparable skill sets in the market. This, of course, gives us the opportunity to make sure we're competitive. And finally, we need to know how well the employees are doing the job so that we can pay people according to that performance. When we have those three pieces in place, and if your pay program can do those three things, you're in a position where instead of that blank screen we had with just objective determined individual value at the top, we actually have reduced that to that small little triangle you see in the middle of the screen. And that small little triangle in the middle of the screen represents something important. We know what the value of a person is to us. It falls inside that little triangle. We also know that people are people, and so a single little dot's not going to do it. And we're always going to need the flexibility that comes in the process of literally finding and hiring people and making sure they don't leave. So let's talk about these items one at a time. So measuring internal value, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that while jobs or job titles or little paragraph job descriptions may have a meaning in a salary survey, all the people who are participating in that salary survey are doing the best they can to find the jobs in their organization that are most comparable to the job in the survey. Sometimes all they're doing that with is a job title. And as we all know, job titles, particularly nowadays, are given away like candy and frequently have absolutely nothing to do with what the performer or what the individual's duties and responsibilities actually are. So fundamentally, we need to know ourselves what each one of our jobs is responsible for, how to measure performance of it, and then how to look at the competitive market to determine where we're looking. So we need, of course, to do this is to make sure we know what the content of each of our jobs is. So in our assessment tool, you will see a good deal of questions about job descriptions and what they look like and how effective they are. In the development of job description, we want to follow, rather than just making a list of things that people do, we want to follow a format that organizes our thoughts. If you look to the organization chart that you may have developed for your organization, whether it's a formal organization chart or whether it is simply something that's scratched out on the back of a sheet of paper or just sitting there in your mind, there are boxes, and those boxes usually have some sort of descriptive title in them so that we know what in the world that box is supposed to do. But we need to drill down farther to know exactly what it needs to do. And a good job description will be organized in a very top-down way of thinking. It'll start with a purpose. What is the purpose for the job? One sentence or two sentences that explain this is why this job exists. And one of the things that we'll frequently see in job descriptions is a lot of flowery language and a lot of qualitative language and a lot of stuff that's designed to make the job seem possibly more important than it actually is. But for those like me, for example, who need to know how to analyze the content of jobs, we don't need that flowery language. What we need is a statement of purpose. What is this job here for? And then we need to look at what are the major functions of the job. Those sorts of things that if somebody asked you, well, what do you do for a living? They'd be those things that you'd kind of tick off on your fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They'd be broad brush statements. They would be statements literally of responsibility. Why does this job exist? Once we know and once we've captured those responsibilities, we're able to actually look at duties. What are the duties that it takes? What are the specific things that people need to do in order to accomplish their job? So in the context of a medical assistant, for example, most medical assistants will be responsible for rooming patients and taking vital signs and assisting the physician or the mid-level provider. Those are the responsibilities, the kinds of things that you just sort of count on your fingers. The specific duties, the specific competencies, those are things that actually we find can become almost the performance appraisal program, because those are the things that we're actually asking people to do. They're the things that we hire people to do. In order to know what kind of people to hire, we need to know what is expected of those roles. So job descriptions on themselves need to be more than just something we have to do because human resources says we need to do that, or because our accreditation agency says we need to have them. They need to be a tool for developing people. They need to be a tool for knowing what it is that people are expected to do. And finally, they need to be a tool for determining how people should be paid. Because ultimately, if our job is designed correctly and we know what it looks like, in order to know that that job is performing the way that we've designed it in our organization chart and fulfilling all those responsibilities, we need to know what it takes so that we know that when somebody is doing all of that, we can pay them at a competitive and fair rate. So why is it important to look at our job descriptions? Why can't I just say a medical assistant is a medical assistant is a medical assistant? It's because our jobs require more. And to the extent that regardless of your corporate structure, your organizational structure, for those of us whose function is on serving the underserved, we have challenges. We have challenges in every aspect of the jobs that we have. So in the market, and we put that in quotes, we know that jobs, as we've described them, will require some skills. They will require a certain amount of effort. We have those too in our organizations, but we also have something that I call health center stuff. That's the difficulties that come about because of the nature of our patients, the nature of our locations, the nature of their conditions. We don't have cushy suburban private practices, and we don't have hospitals with 50 other employees around us to solve all of our problems for us. Everyone in the organization, from the front desk through the clinical support staff, all the way through the organization, the job is more difficult. And frequently in pay programs, organizations don't recognize this. They look at a survey and they say, oh, a medical assistant should make X, we're paying about X, we should be okay. That would work if our jobs weren't harder. That would work if our jobs didn't require more skills that folks in other healthcare providing areas and industries don't have to have, either because there are other people around to help them or because their patients are easier to deal with. So we need to know what is the premium that we need to pay in order to attract and retain the type of skills that we need to do our jobs, regardless of what the job is. So in order to measure internal value, we start with the question, well, why are you going to do that? And I've tried to explain that a little bit, but our jobs are not like their jobs. As I just mentioned, even within the industry, within the healthcare industry, jobs will be different. We need to know what the premium is, what the difference is between our jobs and those that are in the general market. Some jobs aren't in surveys. It's really nice, I guess, if all we have is medical assistants and dental assistants and maybe medical records clerks, but most smaller not-for-profit organizations, and certainly those in the health center world, and having worked with health centers for more than 25 years, I can attest to this, there are always unusual jobs. There are always hybrids, and we all know that particularly at the management level, we ask people to do 10 or 12 or 13 or 14 different hats, and they pass that on to the rest of their staff. And as a result, we have all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. So what is that unusual job title that we have that no one else has? Where do we decide? How do we decide how to pay people? Well, we may not know what the job is worth externally, but if we know what the job is worth to us, we know that we can target pay opportunities for those jobs consistently on an internal basis. We have combined functions or roles, and if we had a couple of hours, I could spend many of them telling stories about interesting jobs that we've run into in our consulting work with health centers. I'm sure that you all have some of them yourselves, but whether it's the accounting clerk who also does the website, or the billing manager who's also responsible for, say, facilities, these are things that will exist in our organizations for reasons only known to us, and sometimes only to the person in the job. How do we pay somebody like that? Well, we're going to figure it out from our internal value, not our external value. We also don't want to perpetuate market inequity, and I say this because in the not-for-profit healthcare world, we are a very female-dominated group. Most of the support staff are female, and in most of those jobs, there is a difference in the pay in the market, that the market being something we put in quotes. Female-dominated jobs tend to be paid less, and we don't need to continue to perpetuate that. If we have a front desk person whose job is valuable to us as a custodian, we need to pay those people the right way, not simply because custodians might make more out in the market because it tends to be a male-dominated job. We also don't want to run afoul of, and I say this from a risk management point of view, we don't want to run afoul of those, translating those market forces into either overt, which we hope we never have, or unintended discrimination. Internal equity plans, as we'll talk about in a moment, job evaluation plans are designed to be gender neutral, to be race neutral, to be neutral of anything except the actual duties and responsibilities that are performed in the job. So how would one do this? Well, the typical way to do it, and feel free to Google this or send us a question at your heart's content, is the use of a formal job evaluation plan. That's the terminology you will hear. There are many different variants of job evaluation, but fundamentally, they all try to do the same thing. And what they try to do is measure jobs, or rate jobs on objective criteria. If you can imagine trying to say, what is the value of our accountant to us versus the value of our nurse? We may find ourselves having absolutely no way to do that. We'll hold one up in one hand and the other in the other hand and try to figure out which way is more and which way is less. And frankly, we'll never be able to do it. If for no other reason than whatever our background is, we'll tend to be biased towards one or the other. But what we can do is focus on objective criteria that we can measure in every job. For example, how much knowledge and skill does it take to be an accountant? How much knowledge and skill does it take to be a nurse? What sort of problem solving is involved? What sort of control over resources are involved? We can measure jobs on these individual components and then basically add them up together. And most of these programs will have a relatively straightforward scoring model, or put it on a spreadsheet or however you will. But that by measuring jobs on a series of criteria, we can effectively just add up the scores that it generates, and we'll get a total value for each job based on those objective criteria. And what we can do then is use that to ensure that jobs that have a similar value to us will have the same pay opportunities. In typical translation of terminology, that means if the job has a similar score, we just assign it to the same pay grade. We have determined the value of the jobs, and two jobs can be of equal value to us or similar value to us for completely different ways. We could have a job that has a very high skill requirement, but then effectively no supervisory responsibility. Or we can have a management job over relatively simple, non-technical staff. However they come together, they will end up having value. And if you're involved in one of these plans, or if you see one of these plans put in place, or if you're looking at your own program, you should be able to look at all of your jobs sort of on one of the axes here of a graph. And in this case, I've set this one with scores running from 100 to 1,000. And you can see little clusters of boxes, each one of these boxes representing a job. And in a nice, effectively designed program, those clusters of jobs will end up in the same pay grade and therefore have the same pay opportunity. So in the event that I don't have a number to look at from a survey, I may not know what that job's value is outside, but I know what it is inside. So a system that allows you to do this is essential to a really effective compensation program. This approach adds in an element like helping you determine if you have multiple layers of professional jobs, for example, or nurses or LPNs versus MAs, and you're trying to look at what the relative difference is to them, or how much more to pay somebody who is in a lead role, roles that often do not appear in surveys. We may not know what that looks like outside, but we can see it inside. Now, of course, you'll see there, obviously, there are no dollar signs there. So how do we translate all of this into some actual money and something that we can actually work with? Well, here we need to look at competitive data. We need to take what we've already done here, which is look at the value of the job to the organization, and add the value of the skills to the market so we can start kind of honing down into some actual numbers. Well, how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to start with something that is definitely a part of our assessment tool and probably an area that most organizations have not really formally addressed, and that's a compensation philosophy. It's not something really too high level and sophisticated. It's more along the lines of what is it that we are that we are doing and why are we doing it? How are we going to approach pay? So, for example, many not-for-profit organizations make their dangerously erroneous leap to say that because we are not-for-profit, it means we should pay as little as we can. Not-for-profit, of course, is just a tax status. It means absolutely nothing other than that. It certainly doesn't point to whether we should be concerned with providing good services or cheap services. I go to a lot of health centers, and when I'm at this point in my presentation, I'll typically look around the room and say, I know somewhere up here you've got a mission statement. And I bet your mission statement does not say, our objective is to provide whatever kind of care we can manage based on whoever we can scrape up off the street to perform our jobs. Our mission statements are going to say something along the lines of, we exist to provide excellent care to the underserved. And we can't do that by being cheap. So your compensation philosophy has to say what you're intending to do. A compensation philosophy can say, we are intended to be competitive at the middle of the market. Or it might say, we are intending, because of the difficulties we have in bringing people into our rural communities, to pay 10% above the market. We could be in a situation where our philosophy is to pay below the center of the market, but we have to recognize that when we do that, we guarantee that the quality of the staff that we'll be able to recruit and retain will be continuously lower than it should be. We've changed our labor pool. And it'll also be a situation where when we find the right people in that labor pool, we will train them up and have them move on. You know, the turnover rate right now in healthcare on its own is about 22%. In federally qualified health centers, it's somewhere between 28 and 35, depending on where you are. And that's just not something that can be sustainable if we are actually going to work with our community and work with our patients. So we need to have a compensation philosophy, and if you've got a board to work with, it should be board approved. Compensation needs to be consistent with health center industry practices. Whatever aspect of the industry you're in, you need to know what others do because folks have the same business models. If we have the similar business models, we'll know, generally speaking, we're going to have similar mixes of income and we're going to have similar mixes of expenses. But very importantly, and as I noted just earlier, it needs to reflect the needs and the mission of the organization. If we as an organization require higher levels of skills, we need to set our position to the market as a whole in a position that will actually give us the ability to do that. So what do these philosophies do? Well, they provide a number of things for the organization. For one thing, they provide continuity from one board and management to another. And I'll tell you that while this is about staff compensation, we do a lot of work with organizations on their top executives' compensation. And one of the most stressful things for any executive to do is have its board turn over every couple of years and have people with different expectations, different understandings of what pay should be. And this carries through to your executives who are trying to develop programs for the staff. We need to have continuity. We need to have something established at the policy level that really explains to the organization, this is the position we have taken toward pay. It certainly provides instructions to researchers, whether they're your internal staff or someone from the outside. What is this market that we're looking at? It tells us what we're going to do, and it gives us a better understanding for budgeting purposes. We need to know what the cost of each box on our organization chart is to actually know if we can afford to do what we say we're going to afford to do. And if we can't, we need to figure out how we can either raise, obviously, our income somehow or do something with our expenses. But given that people are going to be the biggest expense item on the budget, they directly reflect our ability to do what we need to do. So what does a compensation philosophy look like? Well, a compensation philosophy is going to be a statement, usually a couple of sentences, and it's going to start probably with some language like the philosophy of the organization is to compensate. How? Well, how are we going to compensate? Are we going to be an organization that essentially just pays base pay and doesn't worry about anything else? Or are there going to be positions that have opportunities for incentives? Why are we paying people? Are we paying people just to get the job done? Are we paying people more in order to get work and skills sets of a higher level? What elements are we going to use? Are we going to be primarily focused on pay, or are benefits going to be essential to us? Many organizations do believe that if they have a great benefit program, they don't need to pay as much. The problem is, while that might work for our providers and our our management staff, I can't pay for groceries with my 401k contribution. And recognizing that staff pay is definitely much more focused on base pay than anything else is essential. Who are we going to compare to? What is our market? When you look at the elements of what we're going to describe as the data that we're looking for, it's going to be different for each job, and it's important for us to know that. At what level, as I mentioned earlier, are we looking at the median? Are we looking at the average? Are we looking at some other place related to that? So how will we do that? Well, measuring external value is really a function of making sure we have the right data. So what does using the right data mean? Well, we want to only use reputable published surveys. And many people will not recognize that some of the nice free resources they have online, whether it's PayScale or Salary.com, are really not going to provide us the information that we really need. So what we need to do is look at the data that's going to be available for us and that we're going to be able to use from time to time. We're always going to want to focus on multiple surveys. I've been working with a couple of organizations right now that have depended on one survey. And it's a pretty good survey, except for the problem that within this particular survey last year, many of the market rates actually decreased. And we know that that's not what's happening in the actual labor market. And what we suspect it is simply a different turnover in the participants in the survey that has resulted in lower paying organizations being our participants. The rates go down. We know the market's not going down, but the rates go down. So we always want to use multiple surveys. The more the merrier, as long as they're good. We want to carefully consider data, and when it comes to what the market is for any job, there are basically three things that we'll always want to look at. In assessing your program, look at whether you are looking at these things. What is the relevant geographic area? For my staff, it's probably going to be local. It's going to be within a commuting distance. As I go up through the organization to professional staff, certainly to providers and to executive staff, we're going to be looking on at least a regional and probably a national basis. What industry counts? Well, yes, for our clinical folks, we're probably going to be dealing with healthcare in one form or the other. But a lot of our entry-level jobs, when we're training people, when we're bringing them out of high school, they can go work anywhere. They can work at Walmart. They can work at the local factory. We have to know that those skill sets at that level, the kind of raw skills, can be purchased by absolutely anyone. And if we don't know what the other entities are paying in our area, whether it's the state or the city or the county or Walmart, for that level of jobs, we may have a hard time bringing people into the organization, even at an untrained level. Finally, we have to look at our own sizes and resources. Resources are obvious, but within every industry, organization size is a good predictor of pay, particularly as we move up the organization chart. So we need to make sure we're looking at our true peers. We really do have to watch out for trends. Labor market movement, and again, I love to put things in quotes, is not always intuitive. For example, when the economy is booming and things are going well, labor market rates and surveys may often decline. You might say, well, that makes absolutely no sense at all. The economy is booming, everybody's getting increases. Why is that? The reality is simply that most people hire new people at a lower rate. And if we're in a hiring boom and we add half a dozen people into our organization at a lowest rate, the average pay we pay to people on those jobs will actually go down. And we report those to surveys, and the surveys, if enough of that is happening, will show a decline in rates. Not probably unexpectedly, given that lead-in, in times of recession, survey rates tend to go up because we will tend to lay off those for people who are the lower tenured and lowest paid, leaving us with higher average pay. We report that data, all of us report that data, survey says the market rates go up. So be very careful when we're in one of those trends to see what exactly is going on. And frankly, blind dependence on data leads to mistakes. And I'm not going to sit here publicly criticizing every source of data that's out there, but I've watched people use a single source of data and not take into account anything related to the internal value of jobs. And people lose people, or they pay them too much. But this kind of blind dependence on a page in a survey is much more problematic than you might think. Think about a survey as a tool. Think about a survey as a diagnostic test. It's only a piece of the puzzle. So how do we combine these two? Well, we can do it mathematically, actually, and I promise there will be no quizzes on this. But in a well-designed compensation program, we'll take into account the values internally, the ones we looked at a few slides ago, and the values externally. If we plot every one of our jobs on a simple graph like this, we can see the relationship between internal and external values. And we can also see how we may not know the market value of a job, but by knowing the internal value of it, we can kind of scoot on over to the green line on this page and then drop down to our x-axis there and see what that job is worth for us. It allows us to look at how much more a job is required in our organization is going to be worth translated into dollars and cents. So a program that's really effective will have the internal aspect of jobs taken care of, and it'll have the external aspects of jobs taken care of, and allow us to have a target. And that line represents what the target pay would be for somebody who is doing the job the way the job is supposed to be done. It's how we would pay that person and how we would budget for that person on our organization chart, that box. What does that box cost? Now, of course, that again makes the statement that we've got somebody who's doing the job the way the job is supposed to be done, and of course, we don't always have that. So what a good pay program will have is a range of pay or a pay structure that's built around that line. So I've illustrated a simple one here, and I've illustrated a couple of concepts that are important to note in looking at your own pay structures. Near the bottom of the structure, for those jobs that we would be paying the least amount, the range of pay needs to be narrower. It needs to be narrower because there's not as much variation in the skill set required for the job, and there's not as much variation in the labor market. As we move up through our structure, our ranges are going to become wider, and that reflects the fact that there's more variation in what job responsibilities are and what performance could be. Another feature that you can see in this particular line, and my use of pretty colors, is the idea that we can divide these ranges up into pieces so that people who are performing at various levels can be placed in that range in the right place. So in this particular illustration, we have a red part of the range that is indicative of what pay should be for people who are brand new on the job. And I don't mean that necessarily just that you've just employed, but those people who have the lowest level of skills, the lowest level of experience, the people we're training internally, or the people that we're kind of taking a flyer on. As people grow through the ranges or growth in their job, we'd expect to be paying them more. So very roughly illustrated here, I have my green line from the prior slide illustrating where sort of mastery of the job comes in. Those people who are doing the job the way the job is supposed to be done. Clearly, there are the opportunities for people to do more than that for us. And so we provide something which I've kind of called the added value section of the range here. So what you should be able to do is look at your own pay structure and divide it up in pieces like that if it's not already divided up, and look and see, are we actually paying people in the right part of the range based on what they are doing for us? So what are they doing for us? Well, that gets us to the area of performance assessment or performance management, and probably into the area of human resources that people like the least, this dreaded performance appraisal. But we can have a performance management program that's effective without having something that we dread. And that's what gets us to the final piece. Our first two pieces were focusing on the pay ranges. That's what these two did. The value of the job to the organization, the value of the skills in the market. That gets us to what we want to pay people. Now, where in that range is where we get to this idea of how well individual employees perform their own job duties. So let's spend a couple moments looking at that. What are the problems that we run across when we look at how people administer their pay? Well, many of them are quite fundamental, and many of them, unfortunately, are the ways that most organizations actually do manage pay. So let's look at some. General increases. What's a general increase? Well, it's the kind of thing where we give everybody the same percentage or the same dollar amount. We might do it from the consumer price index, or we might do it because that's what surveys say. But a general increase on its own is not going to recognize an employee's growth. In some cases, it fixes that person's pay at the very spot in relation to every other employee in that job where they came in. So a general increase on its own, while it might be nice to kind of keep up and have people not lose pace from where they came in, it's not going to be enough to actually move people and pay them more based on their development. Merit budgets, or merit pay, another typical method. They really function more, and those who actually have to administer them will probably admit it, as a way of distributing scarce resources rather than actually valuing development and growth. Because the truth of the matter is that most merit programs do not provide enough in the area of compensation to match development. We're going to show that graphically in a couple of minutes, but it's really important to understand that these programs have developed over the idea over time that we will be able to pay people more for doing more for us, but if they don't actually fulfill that function, they become a negative. We tout a program as being something that allows us to keep pace, and then we don't actually do that. So our objective here is to come up with something better, but we also have to be very wary of arbitrary policies. Those kinds of policies that we might have that say no employee can get an increase of more than 8%, or when someone is promoted, they will be eligible for an increase of 12%. Those arbitrary policies do not reflect our reality, and once again, they tend to cause more problems. So why is this important? Well, let's look for a second at how people grow. And this is something that's very important to understand because we don't always recognize this in our pay programs. People tend to grow quickly in their jobs. Those who come in with little to no skills in some jobs, they may be fully up to speed in 6 weeks. They may be fully up to speed in a year. Certainly, if an employee working as our front desk receptionist is not doing the job correctly within a year, we really have to ask the question of whether that person is appropriate for us. But whether the job takes 6 weeks, 6 months, a year, or 5 years to learn, people are going to learn most of the fundamental skills early in their career. Their value to you is going to increase the most at that time. Well, the problem is, from an outside perspective, their value in the outside world has also increased at a relatively dramatic rate. So if we take an example of what will happen with a job as simple as our front desk person and how our compensation programs fail them and us, this graphic kind of illustrates it. If we look at the value of an individual person, and we reference the salary surveys, and we look at somebody who's coming in with minimal skills, we expect them to learn most of their job relatively quickly, and that's also when their value in the outside world is going to increase the most. So hiring somebody with a diploma or a certificate and nothing else, we're probably not going to be paying all that much. Somebody who has been working in the industry for a couple of years with that same skill set, we're going to be willing to pay a lot more. And if we're going to do that when we're hiring, why would we not expect that everyone else will? That's why we become the great training ground. We find people, we train them up, and we leave them, and we let them leave. The reason we do that is because the typical pay program is going to provide an average increase of about 3% a year or even less over an employee's career. And that's what that red line is. So the green line represents somebody's value, their ability using their skills and your training to generate income for themselves. That green line compared to the red line shows us the problem. And that's why we find that, as most employers do, pay-related turnover is the worst in years 2 through 5. People don't necessarily want to jump from one job to another after 2 years because it doesn't look good on their resume. But that's when they start to find the biggest difference between what they're being paid and what their value now is in the market. And if you sort of extrapolate out this chart, and I didn't do it just because I wanted 10 years to show the difference, those lines don't intersect until about year 17. And you're going to be hard-pressed to find a front desk person who would like to stick around for 17 years just to be paid what they're worth. And recognize also that we can hardly blame folks in this position. These are the people who are worried about groceries on Friday night. And we shouldn't be surprised to find them leaving for 25 cents, 50 cents, $1 an hour, or frankly, in the situation that many of our clients face, $3 to $4 an hour to leave. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to all of a sudden have all this money, and we're not printing money up in the basement, but we can't set ourselves up with a program that's designed to fail. How do we do this? Well, we have to get away and, again, look to your own performance appraisal program to see if what you're actually doing is measuring value or performance. Performance is, what did you do for me last year? Performance is generating an increase that will be with somebody their entire career. But as noted with the general increases earlier in that graphic on the last page, performance increases like that may not be enough. We need instead to focus on value. So earlier on, I talked about performance management and using a copy of the job description to do performance management. I often tell people, although it cuts down on my consulting revenue, that they can solve the whole performance management crisis by just pulling out copies of their job descriptions, writing in a pencil in the margins on each person how much of the job they're accomplishing. Just adding it up, what percentage of it is being done the way it's supposed to be done. That's effectively the most simple, brutally easy performance appraisal process, because you're not focusing on characteristics of individuals or trying to develop goals or whatever interesting things are in your one-size-fits-all performance appraisal form. When you measure mastery against the purpose of the job, you really get to a formula, even as much if you'd like to, that tells you exactly where in a pay range somebody should be paid. If your performance management program, if your performance appraisal program is just saying, hey, I have an average of 3.5 for this year, so that generates X, you really don't know whether somebody's mastered a job. All you know is how well they did last year, and frequently on some criteria aren't even necessarily job related. So how do we do this? Well, look at your own performance management program. Ask yourself the question, is it measuring how much of a job somebody is doing effectively? If it's not doing that, you're kind of wasting your time. We need to make sure that it's measuring what people can see. The things in the job description should be observable behaviors. They should be things that we, after all, that's what we want to see out of the job, so why don't we measure that? Supervisory opinion shouldn't be a part of it. In some jobs, it's really easy. If we look at our medical assistants, we can certainly measure their competencies to perform many of the services that they need to perform. And only after we've done with all that do we need to start getting into their attitude and other things that impact their performance. But we can certainly see those competencies. We can test those competencies. And those should be the primary drivers of what the value of that set of skills is going to be. We want to do our best to measure things that are objective. And people will say, well, that's really hard to do. I don't know how to do that. We get into this debate all the time. But it's a mindset thing. It really is something that you just have to look at and say, if I have a perfect person in job X, what does that person look like? And I certainly don't mean their physical appearance, but what does their performance look like? If I have a group of medical assistants and I want to know how to measure performance, the first thing I want to do is find a medical assistant that's doing the job the way I want it done. And then ask the question, why did I say that? You get enough people in a room together and get them to agree on who are the good medical assistants, and I think you'll find that it's very easy to come up with those characteristics that you can actually measure. Another thing that's really important and why it's so crucial to get away from this annual performance review that has 1 through 5 scale where 3 is meets expectations and 5 is exceeds expectations and no one exactly knows what expectations are, is that when you design that job, when you put it on the organization chart, when you created a box, when you created a slot in your budget, you budgeted for everything in that job to be done, not just parts of those jobs. So if your performance appraisal system allows somebody to come out at meets expectations by being really great on a couple of things and not being very good at the other things, it's not an effective program. Because basically what happens is those things that aren't being done either aren't being done or they're being done by somebody else. And if you thought they were important enough to include in the job, you shouldn't be paying somebody to do those things until they're actually doing them. So look at your performance system, and again, when we develop the tool, you'll be able to look at this more specifically, but is it possible for somebody to score 100%, if you will, or meeting all expectations without actually doing everything that's in the job. So what should our program be designed to do? Well, our program should be designed to move people through our pay ranges in a way that is consistent with their growth. So I've just illustrated quickly here a couple of, or a pay range for a job, not entirely sure what it is, but I've shown you how pay grades may move over time. Sometimes the market does very little, as in between 2020 and 2021 on my magic crystal ball here. Sometimes it moves a lot, like from 2018 to 2019. But what I have to do in my pay management process is get people from wherever they started to wherever they eventually are. So imagine somebody that you hire right out of high school, perhaps with bare minimum skills. We're going to train that person up. That person is represented by this white line here. They start at the bottom of our range, but over 5 years, and frankly, if it's a front desk person, it should be more like 2 rather than 5. I need to move somebody not just through the range, but through the moving range. So this might be our, riding on the back of a horse, shooting at a moving target, and we don't know who's chasing us. But nevertheless, we know that for somebody like that, increases early in their career need to be larger on a percentage basis because we have to move people through 2 dimensions. Other people that we hire who know how to do the job, the ones we just have to kind of point to the bathroom key and show them how to move the coffee or how to make the coffee, our objective is to continue to pay people in that part of the range. So increases will tend to not be as large. Finally, we have that situation that sometimes occurs when we may have to pay somebody more initially, maybe because there's a shortage of skills at some given time, or there's something going on in our local market that causes us to do that. In a pay program, our desire, and of course none of these lines are actually going to be straight, but our desire is to let the pay ranges catch up and not make the problem worse. So our program has to do that. And if we can't look at our program and say it's going to do that, then we're going to fail in one of our 3 aspects, either having people paid what they're worth internally or what they're worth externally or what their performance dictates. So those 3 things have to appear in our compensation programs. So let's look at a quick test. And this is, I guess, what I would call your homework assignment. And what I'd like you to do, whether you do it right now or later on today, is to simply do the following things. And I realize if you're a big organization, it may take you a while, so maybe just do a sample. But assess each staff member's current performance on a really simple scale, where 100% equals does the job the way it's supposed to do. So you can make this as arbitrary as you want. It doesn't really matter. But if somebody has got about half the job nailed down, give them a score of 50%. If they're almost but not quite there, give them a score of 90%. If for some reason they truly do walk on water and do more than you could ever expect, go over 100%. But simply do that. Get yourself a list, put a spreadsheet together, assess your staff members, and see if they in fact, or see what their scores are going to be on this scale. If your programs, if you don't have the ability to do that right now, then you've got problems. If your job descriptions aren't designed well enough to let you know what they're supposed to be doing, you have problems. If your performance management program doesn't generate the ability through all of its convolutions to tell you how people actually perform the aspects of their job, you've got trouble. There are things you're going to need to work on. So once you've done that, create a target rate of pay for each staff member based on the performance score in your pay program. What does that mean? Well, I'm willing to hazard a guess that most of the folks listening are not going to be able to do this. And I will suggest that that means you have some areas to work on. First of all, you may not have ranges, or your ranges might not actually be tied to a position in the market that's based on a compensation philosophy. So it's going to be a struggle for you to figure out what that is. But you should be able to, somebody from the outside or somebody from the inside, particularly someone you're supposed to explain your performance program to, should be able to look at someone's performance, look at your pay scale, and figure out exactly where somebody should be paid in that range. Now compare those two. And compare those two for each one of your employees. Each person that's off, that is their target and their actual pay, is either a flight risk or you're paying above value for them. And pay systems need to be designed, their entire existence should be to eliminate any of this variance. where target pay and actual pay are not the same. And if you can't do this, then there are so many opportunities for you to improve your pay program. So ultimately, look at that as a quick test of your pay program. Take any single individual in your organization. If you can tell me what percentage of their job they've mastered, I should be able to tell you what they're paid. And if I can't do that looking at your pay program, you've got a lot of work to do. Well, how would you budget in a program that works like that? Well, it should be pretty easy. The budget is simply the number of employees multiplied by the target pay for each position. If I have 20 medical assistants, it should be 20 times my midpoint or my target for medical assistants. And that's my MA budget. If I can't do that, if I look at those numbers and I can't match my ability to pay, it either means, well, it means it's unsustainable. It either means that I can't hire people to fill those roles, or I'm going to be turning over to people in those roles, meaning they won't be around when I need them, and I simply can't sustain it financially. But because of turnover and development, of course, you're never going to have a situation where everybody's at budget. You shouldn't, because you'll always have people around that are not 100%. So changes in the budget, many finance people will tell you, okay, well, we can afford to increase pay 2% this year. That may not actually make sense, because kind of the market really doesn't care what your resources are. The market is going to move regardless of that. What you need to know is, what are the price tags of all your employees before you decide whether you can actually afford to do that. Similarly, those people who will set their budget because they read a survey said pay is going to increase 3%, those issues those are other people. That's not you. That's not your workforce. So setting budgets by what others do is not really relevant to your budget. What does it all mean as we come to the end of our session today? Compensation needs to be managed by programs, not decisions. That was what Sun Tzu's quote was at the beginning. And what programs are going to do is allow us to fulfill these steps or these areas that I discussed earlier. Jobs can't be valued without being understood, so we have to have job descriptions that are effective. Programs can't be developed without a philosophy. How can I establish a pay range if I don't know why we're even paying people? To be effective, our compensation programs have to include those three key elements. Number one, a model for determining the internal value of jobs. Number two, a model for determining the external value of jobs. And finally, a method for ensuring that each staff member is paid according to their contribution. When we've got all of those elements in place, and you'll kind of notice that those 5 bullet points go back to my 5 areas of interest at the beginning. When you've analyzed each one of those, and when you can be sure that you have done the best you can to put into play policies to affect all of those, then you'll know that you have an effective staff compensation program. I hope that I've provided you with some things to think about today. Also want to let you know that eventually, when the assessment tool is up on the website, you'll be able to look at it and judge for yourself and measure for yourself how well you are accomplishing each of those things. I would like to let you know, and I'm sure there'll be some closing comments from Suzanne here, but if you need to reach me, this is where I am. And I can, generally speaking, be reached most easily at my website or at my email address right there. Also, for some of you who may not know it, we haven't spoken to before, if you go to our blog, it's mercerchconsulting.com. That blog is focused on dealing with issues of interest to health centers, predominantly focused toward federally qualified health centers, but obviously to anyone in that same situation. And it's all about compensation, everywhere from the staff to senior management. So with that, again, I would like to thank you. If there are any questions that have come up, I would be happy to address them at this time.
All right, did we have any questions come through?
We haven't had any questions come through just yet. Let's leave the lines open for just a minute.
Okay, perfect. Well, Ed, we really appreciate you being with us today, and appreciate all your insight, and gives us a lot to think about. So we really appreciate your time, and If we don't have any questions come in, then we are right at the top of the hour. So we will go ahead and sign off for now. We look forward to seeing everyone in 2 weeks for our next in the series.